Hi everybody, once again, this is Zeri, Persian pen name on AO3. I'm on week, was it 41? Yeah, of my transition. And yeah, I'm here to read you some stories. Um, what's been going on this week? I had my checkup with my endocrinologist. Um, to see how I'm doing on the injectable. All of that seems to be going well. I haven't heard back yet on what my testosterone levels are like. I'm still a little got stuff in the throat, um, just from general allergens being around everywhere right now and being a few weeks out from COVID. Uh, but honestly, I was chatting on voice with some friends last night, and my spouse, and they were saying how different my voice sounds, and I was like, oh yeah, it's just super froggy right now from the COVID stuff. And my spouse was like, no, that's just what her voice sounds like now these days. That's pretty accurate. So I thought that was pretty neat. Let's see what else has been up. Yeah. Pardon me, indeed. Uh, I've been working on some sewing. I've got a couple yards of some fun, gay dad at the barbecue type fabrics. Uh, and I've got like 10 yards of this white linen that I got from Fabric Store. Um, yeah, fabric-store.com. Great place for linen by the yard. Uh, but yeah, I got that well over a year ago, I want to say. I was going to make some Victorian combinations. Pardon. And that I never did. Because I didn't want it. I couldn't find an insertion lace that I liked very much. So I never made anything with it. So now I'll be making these shirts. And they're just, I want to be able to do nice button-down dress shirts. So I'll try. I've got a pretty good mock-up in muslin. I need to move. I've got the. One second. Yeah. Right now in my shirt, in my muslin, um, this is where I've got the shoulder seam right here on the apex of my shoulder, and it needs to be like right here, right where things, fall. Uh, so I need to adjust my arm side, but that's not insurmountable. So that's probably what I'll spend the rest of my day doing. I need to iron that linen, and yeah, and then I'll start transferring my patterns, cutting, and getting all of that ready for later. Da, 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 da. And then I'll have something to do with my hands when I'm at work, which is always nice. In theory, I could go get something hot to drink, and that would help my throat quite a lot. But also, it's Texas, and it's like 100 something degrees all the damn time, and I don't want anything hot if I don't have to. But anyway, so that's been this week. It's time to read a story. This is another original work. It's from Original Works Opportunity 2020. The title is A Different Sort of Vows by Perfectly Steadfast. The relationship is male priest being forced to give up his vows to marry for political reasons, / his husband. And it was for Hicks sit-in. So, a different sort of vows. Hurry up, they won't wait all day. Rendon slid his fingers along his beads, his lips moving through the circuit. He would not be rushed through his prayers, even as his uncle paced. You didn't even want to go to the temple, he said. You should be glad I got you out. Unhurried, Rendon gathered the beads and tucked them away. Perhaps I grew to like it. Have you considered that? No, Uncle Hager consulted his pocket watch. It doesn't exactly matter, now does it? No, I suppose it doesn't. Briefly, Rendon wondered what it would have been like to have a family that loved him and wanted the best for him, but he'd long since accepted that that was not his lot in life. He thought his lot in life would be to serve the gods, but that hadn't been in the stars either. He couldn't believe it had been only 2 weeks. It had been only 2 weeks ago that he'd been in residence at the Full Moon Temple. Rendon had been preparing to lead Vespers when an acolyte had appeared in his study to alert him of his uncle's arrival. Hager had looked uncomfortable, seated in the waiting room for the unconsecrated. Rendon recalled from his childhood that his uncle had never been an observant man. Which perhaps made it all the more ironic that he'd dumped Rendon at the temple as soon as he'd turned 13. What do you want? Even years of temple training and taking his vows had not made Rendon so forgiving he could receive his uncle with grace. Your family needs you, Hager had said, and then he'd outlined this ridiculous plan. And now Rendon was walking through the chapel like a lamb led to the slaughter. Artos braced up, hands behind his back as his betrothed approached. He looked rather grim, perhaps even more grim than Artos felt. He glanced at Master von Imrich. Artos hadn't liked the merchant from the moment he laid eyes on him, and the feeling was confirmed by the way he seemed to be treating his nephew. Artos was the opposite of a religious man, but even he knew it was wrong to pull a priest out of a respite temple and make him marry. Priests of the faith, especially those at respite temples, were married to one of the gods. At least, it went something like that. They certainly weren't supposed to be pulled out of temples to marry scarred old soldiers. Rendon was handsome, he had to admit, though he felt wrong having such thoughts about a priest. Not a priest, he reminded himself, his husband-to-be. Rendon looked as though he were being led to his own execution. He didn't smile or even look at Artos when Hager von Imrich placed his hand in Artos's. Artos had to admit it was a ridiculous tradition, especially given the circumstances. Von Imrich could hardly be said to be giving Rendon away, when he'd given him to the faith all those years ago. And then von Imrich was stepping away, leaving one very dour-looking bridegroom and the priest advancing on them. Rendon managed to maintain his composure through the ceremony and the feast. His new husband didn't partake of the drink or the dancing, which suited Rendon just fine. He didn't feel like doing either. He ate 1 serving of dinner, and when his husband stood up, he followed. If you don't wish to consummate the marriage, I won't push you. Thank you. A weight was suddenly lifted from Rendon's shoulders. He gave a wary glance up at his husband. Artos. That was his first name. Artos, Lord Morin. It was raining when they left von Imrich Manor, and a servant held an umbrella over their heads as they dashed for the waiting coach. Rendon noticed that Artos didn't exactly dash per se. He walked with a slight limp, and Rendon slowed his pace instinctively to match his. The rain, Artos explained as he swung into the carriage and reached for Rendon's hand. It makes it ache some. You were at the border during the wars. I was. May Shimmer's blessing be upon you. It only bothers me sometimes, he explained. Rendon couldn't see his expression as the coach moved out of the streetlights. There was a leaden pause. "Was that your goddess? Shimra?" "Yes." "I'm sorry." Rendon bit his lip. He didn't know how to process the idea that Artos might be sorry. Sorry for him? Sorry for marrying him? Sorry that any of this had happened? "So am I." "I didn't ask for this," Artos said slowly. Rendon wondered if he found it easier to talk in the dark like this. "I never expected to inherit, nor did I ask for my father to, be so deep in debt to my uncle?" "Indeed." "And I was the only one he had left to marry off," Rendon sighed. "He didn't really have me at all, in truth." "That's what I'm sorry about. It wasn't right what happened to you." "Nor to you." Artis made a noise that might have been a sigh, or the verbal equivalent of a shrug. "I wasn't exactly beating suitors off with a stick." Rendon found he wanted to say more, but Artis had turned himself away, such that Rendon supposed the conversation was over. Pardon. Artis tried to give Rendon space. It ought to have been easy to do. He was used to life alone in the big manor house without him. Surely it would be easy to go on pretending he wasn't there. And initially, Rendon made himself easy to forget. They ate separately, and Rendon stayed in his rooms most of the time. When Rendon wasn't in his rooms, Artis stayed in his own rooms, so that Rendon wouldn't have to encounter him. He gradually became used to his husband's daily rhythms. Prayers, meals, and trips to the library seemed to make up the chief part of it. At least, he thought he had those rhythms memorized, until he opened the library door to find Rendon curled in an armchair, reading a book. "Forgive me," Artis bowed formally. It seemed like the right thing to do, to bow to Rendon. He could easily imagine him as a scholarly priest, not one of the ones who told Artis he'd somehow brought his wounds on himself for some unspecified immorality. "You can stay," Rendon said, closing his books. "It's your house." "It's our house. More than big enough to share." He took up his book and sat in his own armchair. Rendon made no move to rise. They were within 10 feet of each other, closer than they'd been since they'd been in the coach. Artis gave him a wary glance and found Rendon watching him just as cautiously. "I'll go," he said. "No, don't. We're in this together, aren't we? Might as well be friends." "Might as well," Artis agreed. He opened his book, and they said nothing for the rest of the afternoon. Reading silently together in the library became a near-daily occurrence, and it soon came to drive Rendon mad. Artis was avoiding him. He'd liked this at first, had needed the space to get used to the idea of being married, to get used to the idea of life outside the temple again, to remember that once he'd been a young boy who had expected to have this kind of life. He'd only been 13 when he'd been sent away, but that had been old enough to imagine a life much like this, marriage to a lord of some large estate. "I was thinking of going into the village," he told Artis one afternoon during their library session. "I want to meet the temple priest, at least, and see some of the tenants." Artis looked surprised, and for a moment Rendon thought he might refuse. No, he reminded himself, he wasn't that kind of man. He knew that much about him so far. "I'll take you," Artis said finally. "You should be with me when you meet them." "I would like that," he said, smiling. Artis quickly looked away. Yes, that was the most frustrating part. Either Artis wanted nothing to do with him, or he felt some ridiculous guilt about attempting to seduce a priest. Rendon thought which one seemed more likely, and smiled to himself. If Artis wouldn't seduce him, there was only one way to go about it. It was a pleasant day, fresh after a morning rain when they set out. Artis was struck by a sudden guilt that he hadn't ridden out to meet his tenants in a long time. He hadn't ridden anywhere in a long time. And they did seem surprised to see him, having only seen their lord going to and fro in his dark coach. He tried to smile at people and greet them pleasantly, but he could see immediately that Rendon more than made up for any of his deficiencies. He had a natural way with people, able to talk to grumpy old farmers and young children alike. Artis had worried about meeting with the village priest, that it might arouse some feelings of jealousy or sadness in Rendon, but if he felt at all wistful, he didn't show it. He decided to mention it, just to see Rendon's reaction. "This is my life now," he said matter-of-factly. "I am your husband, and that carries with it certain duties." Ah, so it was about duty. That made sense. Rendon took Artis's hand, though, and they made the rest of their circuit of the village, holding hands. Daily rides about the estate had been added to their daily routine, and Rendon relished them just as much as he did their afternoons in the library, or the meals they'd begun